So when I first started exploring 3D printing in my own research through the lenses of media studies, maker culture, feminist material culture, and critical making, those early days, I didn't know how to make things for myself, and so I would often find myself at 3D printing websites such as thingiverse.com. Thingiverse is a website that allows users to upload and download 3D files for printing. The categories of the types of things is expansive, things like household items, battery holders or vases, fandom objects like busts of Yoda, jewelry, name tags, just about everything. But for the project I was making, I was specifically looking for a person, so a little miniature person to put in one of my projects. And when I searched for person, here's what I found. Perhaps as expected, some androcentric figures standing in for person. And for the project I was making, I needed the figurine to be a woman. I mean, maybe this figurine is a woman, who's to say? But also, I needed the ability to pose the figurine in various ways. And I couldn't do that with this model at that time. So out of curiosity, I searched specifically for the term woman to see what the search results may yield. And here's what I found. Several headless, armless, legless, nude torsos. So then I searched for man, again curious for the search results, and I didn't really find anything that made much sense in relation to the human figure. So again, none of these would work for me. So back to searching for various search terms with woman or girl. And I thought, okay, what if an alien ship was hovering above the Earth and somehow the only information they would ever know about humans was through Thingiverse? It's the only thing they could pick up. What might they actually think a woman is? And because I wanted to put a full person in my project and not just a pair of breasts or some sort of grotesque torso being strung around on a leash, I realized I'd have to learn a new skill. And this makes me think of Toni Morrison's oft-cited quotation, "If there's a book you want to read but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it." Here, Morrison captures the DIY or do-it-yourself ethos. But if you know anything about her work, it's not just about DIY as satisfying an individual taste, but rather a deeply political project of access, representation, and the kinds of stories and whos that come to populate the world. Telling our stories, if the aura is diverse, resists hegemonic cultural production that promotes the erasure, denial, and devaluation of people of color, women, queers, and other minority groups. These narratives can manifest in any medium or genre: literature, poetry, music, television, or in my case, plastic. And plastic brings me to a question. What do Roland Barthes and the band Aqua have in common? And as it turns out, they both have pretty similar takes on plastic, and I'll return to them in a moment. But if we believe Marshall McLuhan's adage that the medium is the message, then an exploration of remix using a 3D printer necessitates a consideration of that which it prints with: plastic. Plastic is deeply complicated in just about every way: politically, theoretically, compositionally. It is perhaps the most contradictory substance. It is at once popular and ubiquitous, and yet at the same time is deeply mocked, despised, and even feared. In his ruminations on plastic in the 1950s, Barthes captured this ambivalence. Quote, "More than a substance, plastic is the very idea of its infinite transformation. As its vulgar name indicates, it is ubiquity made visible. Moreover, this is the reason why it is a miraculous substance. A miracle is always a sudden conversion of nature. Plastic remains completely impregnated by this astonishment. It is less an object than a trace of movement." End quote. He suggests that despite its infinite possibility, which yields a kind of godlike control over creation, it is also only an imitation of substance or of luxury, merely a vapid surface and prosaic. This is quite similar to the ideas captured in Aqua's 1997 song Barbie Girl, with lyrics that include, "Life in plastic, it's fantastic. You can brush my hair, undress me everywhere. Imagination, life is your creation." Though of course satirical, I hope, plastic affords control, power, and dominance. Responding to this inherent ambivalence and the fine line it treads, contributor Yvonne Shoshoa in the anthology Plastics Now asks, "Plastics, dream or nightmare?" The nightmare is not solely in regard to environmental degradation or in health risk, which it certainly is, but it also evokes even larger stakes in that the allure of plastic is wrapped up and packaged in terms of power, control, and production. 3D printing harnesses this allure, this control over production and creation, fabrication, and makes it more accessible to more people than ever before. This has led many, as indicated by this Economist cover, to imagine that 3D printing will disrupt systems of production, so much in fact that it signals the third industrial revolution. And while I'm interested in that discourse, especially the critiques of that discourse that suggest that mainstream maker culture and uses of 3D printing are more likely to replicate rather than subvert system of power, I want to think here about what this means for countercultural production in relation to access and creation. In other words, I'm interested in what the 3D printer can do besides a mere reduction of scale, like we see here, in which an individual becomes the factory. Perhaps a revolution, but perhaps one without revolutionary politics. I'm interested in what happens when machine-fabricated plastic inhabits non-hegemonic practices. Just like increased access to media technologies allowed for the democratization of expression through photography, film, music, etc., increased access to 3D printing may afford new kinds of making in the medium of plastic. With a historical connection to mass production, plastic objects are often associated with mass ideologies. You can think of Barbie. Perhaps, though, until now. Which brings us to DIY countercultural plastic, or small batch artisanal plastics. So, of course, while tongue-in-cheek, I also think this fits into a larger cultural framework of the growing resistance to mass-produced goods and plastic, what the role of the internet has done to the concept of the expert and to DIY, and identity formation, especially in regard to race, gender, and class, in relation to these practices of consumption and production. But back to subcultural uses of 3D printing. DIY plastic leads to a remixing of cultural codes. It combines the medium that signals mass production with small batch printing, valuelessness due to overabundance in supply with scarcity, the factory line pumping out thousands of a commodity with something more like an oven baking a batch of cookies. It is a culture jamming, appropriation, and hijacking that scrambles form and function. This ironic materiality affords perhaps a new way to remix cultural ideas simply due to the precarious characteristics of plastics and its historical production. And in the very least, it provides a new entry point to material cultural production. So next I want to show the step-by-step process that I use to make the dolls to demonstrate how many choices go into making an object, especially with 3D printing, the bringing it into being. So I follow Matt Rado's concept of critical making, in which he identifies the material productive engagement that is intended to bridge the gap between creative physical and conceptual exploration, which is a lot of what we saw in the last panel and throughout the day. This framework allows me to undertake making as research method and to uncover how materiality operates as the suspended animation of ideology, how the things around us, including ourselves, are material interpolations of internal and external processes as opposed to a static materiality, one that simply is, rather one that becomes. So I first started in Adobe Fuse CC. Body parts have been divided into heads. That's a start. We have some heads. That's good. Torsos, legs, and arms. As categorized, you can see here, you can scroll down for more, but you have them divided by female, male, along a spectrum of skin colors, and all thought-provoking in terms of constructions of sex, gender, ethnicity, race, ability, etc. And then once you have your figure, you get to the customization section here, which allows for full manipulation of a rather normative body. But as a side note, my version of the software, which was preview or beta, doesn't allow me to change any of these settings. So I use default settings, which makes you think about what default means here. All right, so let's see. So next you can select from various forms of clothing. Hold on one sec. Get the animation started here. There we go. You can select for various forms of clothing. The clothing is arranged alphabetically as opposed to how most clothing is divided by binary gender categories, whether in stores, online, otherwise. These selections can be worn by any figure. Once dressed, the figure is ready to be sent to Mixamo, which is user-friendly animation software. All right. So Mixamo uses the Xbot and the Ybot. So here's the Ybot, here's the Xbot, with red and blue color coding to model their animations, defining movement not only by cultural stereotypes, pink and blue, of gender, but also in regard to sex essentialism, sex chromosomes. So despite the figure's categorization as male or female, just like the clothes, any animation can be applied to any figure. I then export the animation file, convert it, prepare it for printing, and print it with a 3D printer. And it's really important to note that I sometimes get the sense that people think 3D printing is magic. Like you just kind of like set it and forget it, and you just like hit print and this thing just pops up in front of you. And the amount of time that it took to get the figures ready to print or even printable at all structurally took the most amount of time, the most amount of iterations. I have several of these that broke in the process that just didn't work. So it's really important to address the fact that the printer, 3D printing can often obscure the labor that goes into this. And so we replace labor for magic. And I do want to resist that a little bit. Okay. So yeah, this is the object you end up with. So then the makerspace I was working in didn't have any army green plastic on hand at the time, so I airbrushed each figurine. So this is what I did over spring break, the entire spring break. And then what I finally ended up with is this. So I'd like to provide a little bit more context for these dolls and why I selected this format. Because they are both incredibly dense cultural objects and widely recognizable, which is perhaps the perfect storm for parody, Green Army Men have been remixed many times over. This form of culture jamming hijacks something that is widely known and immensely popular in order to create awareness about the role of play and toys in children's socialization. Here, especially in regard to militarization and normative gender roles. Here, that corner, we have Yoga Joes, where the parody rests in appropriating poses of violence for those of contemplative meditation. Next, these here in the center are from a series named Casualties of War, made by the Dorothy Art Collective, which suggests that the violence of war extends beyond the battlefield. And finally here, we have the Black Army Men, created by artist Ariel Wilkins, an act, she writes, of demonstrating the strength of our community by silent protest, a fun twist on a classic toy. So I too chose this form to enact remix, specifically queer remix, as a method of scholarly inquiry. So in choosing this, I'm particularly interested in disorientation. Well-known objects like Green Army Men fade into the landscape. They are material assumptions. And I'm interested in the way that a queer remix of these objects can lead to the double take, and what may occur as a result in that moment of disorientation. I believe that that momentary disruption can be a generative moment of critical inquiry and reflection. And further, I'm interested in the juxtaposition of the mass-produced object appropriated and created through DIY 3D printing. And perhaps most of all, the Green Army Men afford the ability to imagine how embodiment, action or pose, situation, narrative, and space all operate together and co-construct one another. And that's central to this project in regard to world building. So moving to the next section. To explain how I approach my research question, what is queerness and what is queer remix in regard to 3D printing, I need to define queer. I am most interested in what can be learned about sex, gender, and sexuality, especially in relation to embodiment, materiality, and identity, when you put plastic dolls at the center. Drawing from Siobhan Somerville's rich discussion of queer, I am framing queerness as a destabilization of binary categorizations of sex, gender, and sexuality, especially as they're used to structure and delimit each other. In terms of remix, this means mixing up these cultural codes while mixing up the structure of these platforms that I just demonstrated. So how do I enact queer remix when I approach this software and I approach 3D printing? So the first thing I did, again, this is a very iterative process, is I went to kind of like a very basic form of queer destabilization that was putting female figure in masculine clothing and then into a Y-bot or male categorized animations. But nothing new or interesting happened. And it also circumscribed queerness to only a kind of simple binary switching, one that can lead to things like femirerasure or a denial that feminine women aren't or simply can't be queer. Also, fictional drag queen Noxeema Jackson in the movie To Wong Foo Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar, points out that there is a difference between a boy in a dress and a drag queen. So I thought to myself, how does a computer do queerness? And so my next answer was, or trial, was if queerness is the destabilization of rigid binaries, then perhaps the generative method to enact computational queerness is through randomization. So that's what I did. I developed a system that assigned numbers to each appearance and animation option in Fuse and in Mixamo. And then at every step that you saw in which a design choice was presented, I threw a pair of dice. And that's how these dolls came to be. So throwing the dice is yet another form of play. It operates as a heuristic. It allowed for computer randomization to bring into being a form of computational queerness. It told me what was queer, and in turn, it evoked new questions of what queerness may be. So these are some of the questions that were revealed in the process of undertaking critical making, queer remix, and 3D printing. What would happen to gender and identity if we also came to be through randomization? For instance, what if everyone was given a box of stuff and that was all they could wear for their lifetime? It would maybe grow with us as we grow too. It would be a randomized box of stuff that signaled various levels of feminine objects and masculine objects. And I wonder, how long would it take for those gendered characteristics to no longer signal femininity or masculinity? And then what other ways would people develop to signal the aesthetics of embodied gender? Would they? What happens when identity is not formed by a rather neoliberal consumerist process of self-making? And then even further, in our current climate in which self-identification is the best way to know someone's gender, what happens when self-identification is not possible? So here these dolls cannot speak. So what is their gender, and do they need one? So in terms of world making, what kind of world would this be if these were a commonplace children's toy? What kind of play would result, and what kind of people would be made in that process? So now that I've made the dolls, why not play with them? A kind of test drive to see what happens when these gender randomized figures go out and play in the gender regulatory world. So Eva's going to play with some of the stuff that I brought here today. All right, so imagine these pieces with another toy, a chess set. Thinking of life as a game presents other ways of exploring it. Various pieces are defined by different rules. The identity of each piece is marked by various levels of power, movement, etc. And for the sake of play, what happens when the pieces specifically centralize the already gendered aspects of chess? Gender becomes a central figure of the game. Can't exactly see what's going on. Gotcha, okay, check. Okay. So these gendered pieces can represent the hegemonic gender binary. Perhaps we can make a few revisions for the sake of gender equity among our cishet friends here. I think you get the picture. So now what happens if we expect the gender randomized dolls to play in this game? Could any actual game be played? What are the rules? What are the moves? And how do you win? Then let's extend this gamification of space and subjectivity beyond chess into another game board of sorts, like a basketball court in a high school gym. This is where other parts of my spring break went. And then, perhaps, one other place. Perhaps it'll change, the same gym will transform into another game board. So, a high school prom, dance floor. And then perhaps one final touch. And then again, the same questions. What are the rules? Who can play? And how do you win? Playing with dolls, then, is a heuristic approach that allows us to sit with miniature simulations of bodies, experiences, and spaces. It encourages us to consider perhaps that we're all dolls playing these games, trying to move, who can, trying to play, who can, and trying to win, who can. We can also do this in digital space. Since I photographed all of them in front of a green screen that I made in my kitchen, they can be placed in infinite situations. The critical act is trying to make meaning out of their rather indeterminate poses, which allows for further speculation about what kinds of situations and worlds these people both were created by and co-construct through their mere existence. So here, maybe this person just accidentally teleported to Mars. Or maybe is having an apprehensive day at the beach. Or maybe this one lives in a world in which spaces and people are made of the same stuff, a flat ontology of sorts. Or perhaps you want to play with yourself. You could 3D scan your own head, like I have done here, and do some speculative selfing, placing yourself in various moments, experiences, and embodiments. To sit and take time with alternative versions of yourself, a kind of lucid dreaming while awake, through various aesthetic and temporal frames, to allow for heuristic explorations of the what-ifs and the so-whats of materiality, spatiality, embodiment, experience, and so on. So what I've presented here is just one part of a much larger project that I'm working on, but overall, I hope I've made the case for the generative value of playing with dolls in terms of queer world building, and also the value of 3D printing and making as a useful technique and method for humanities research.
For the next 15 or so minutes, my task is to orientate you towards this object and to orient all of us in its use. As DB offered a glimpse at what kinds of questions might arise and what kinds of knowledge might be produced from seriously considering playing with dolls as a research methodology, through this transfer station and in relation to a lot of what we've seen today, I offer a related line of inquiry that has emerged from engaging in ritual performance, and specifically the rituals of discard and the infrastructure that supports those rituals as a research method. So I'm taking as my premise Sarah Ahmed's work on orientation, which offers queer scholarly insights around normativity and performativity, or the constructions and enactments of bodies, relations, and identities encountering hegemonic expectations, as DB has helpfully exploded. So Ahmed reads queerness through the object relations that organize, reinforce, or ritualize the signals of power and value our bodies must negotiate. As the quote here suggests, this orientation session is equally geared toward disorienting our embedded, naturalized rituals of handling, or more likely avoiding handling, that particularly power and value saturated object relation, trash. So this transfer station offers a mode of waste management that demands a little more time, thought, and feeling than what regular trash receptacles that our institutions usually afford, but I hope that it's worth the extra effort. And I propose that a foundation might be laid for another possibly queer world. So what do I mean when I say that I'm remixing infrastructures of disposability? Put simply, I've taken a familiar set of objects and operations for disposal, the trash receptacle, the necessary transition of an object from useful to a piece of garbage or a relic or a trace, and the moment of discard itself, and I'm reconfiguring them to enact a process of deep and ongoing meaning making, resisting the evacuation of meaning and the obfuscation of consequence that subtend our current trash rituals, at least here in the United States. So remix is helpful here, especially in its resonance with environmentally minded mantras like reduce, reuse, recycle, because I'm not proposing a zero waste or a slash and burn speculative practice. Rather, I'm trying to imagine what would happen if our processes for handling discard were oriented by and toward queer, feminist politics of care, sensitivity to materiality and embodiment, attunement to the haptics and affects of exchange, and attention toward the labor of maintenance that undergirds and yet often goes unnamed within any notion of sustainability or ecological responsibility. And this kind of work requires a different amount and a different quality of time than do the conventional means of discard those of us sitting in this room likely participate in on a daily basis. So let me describe for you a potentially familiar encounter. An object has ceased to serve you in your life, and you must discard it. When you, in your life, go to throw something away, what do? What have you been trained to do? You find the receptacles that have been made available to you. These are the ones that we have at the University of Maryland, where DB and I are graduate students. Very likely, they're some combination of trash and recycling, maybe compost if your campus is super extra green. You assess which bin is most appropriate to receive the item you're discarding. You put it in, you move on with your life. Our bins, in particular, admonish you, there is no away, but where else is there? There's nowhere else to put it. If trash doesn't go away, where does it go? Who takes it there? What happens when it gets wherever it goes? Does anyone in here know? Maybe? No? In our current regime of waste management in the United States, transfer stations, like these that you see here, are where municipal trash is taken to be sorted and compressed, loaded onto trucks and barges, and processed or sent off to landfills or recycling centers. They are often sited on the margins and the fringes of municipalities, on coastlines, or in rural areas, so as to be minimally present in our public awareness, to keep our trash away from other positively valued social functions. But, as the bin says, there is no away, especially for communities with lesser political and economic power to banish or vanish their trash, and those communities which end up receiving trash expediently removed from places with the social and financial capital to avoid or ignore their own waste. Much in the way the historical practice of redlining, wherein banks and other financial institutions in US cities systematically divest resources from communities of color as a means of producing notions of desirable or undesirable neighborhoods, the capacity to obscure the byproducts of a community's consumption and proximity to repositories of waste reinforce these embedded logics of desirable or undesirable populations, inviolable or disposable people. As I hope to demonstrate, by keeping the management of our trash in intimate proximity, and by providing a different destiny for our discards, and demanding alternative rituals for disposal, this transfer station serves as a speculative infrastructure that resists, or at least complicates, these oppressive logics. So I situate this project in a genealogy of scholarship, art, and performance that's working at the nexus of environmentalism, feminism, and labor. Though there are many forebears worth mentioning, Jo Hansen, Pamela Longobardi, Misha Cardenas, Ana Mendieta, just to name a few, my most significant influence is Meryl Latterman Ukeles, who in 1969 wrote her Maintenance Art Manifesto, which proclaimed that systems of capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, and I would add heteronormativity, value innovation, novelty, and efficiency, the production of new and better things, at the expense of those whose labor simply maintains life inside those systems. She drew connections between the devaluation of mothering and care work traditionally relegated to women and people of color, and the maintenance workers she saw working in the museums and galleries that host art, but whose function is not usually recognized as essential to its livelihood. There's a much longer story from how she got from there to where she ended up, but she has since spent the last 40 years as the artist in residence in the New York City Department of Sanitation, where she's developed performances such as trash barge ballets and maintenance worker parades, which you see right here, choreographic experiments and explorations of the movements of sanitation workers, and an ongoing reconceptualization of the Fresh Kills landfill, which you see right here, which is in Staten Island in New York, and which at the time of its closure in 2001 was the largest landfill in the world, and notably, and perhaps apocryphally, the only man-made structure that you could see from space besides the Great Wall of China. So Euclid outlined the speculative premise that this transfer station takes on. So to call this is her work. To call something garbage means stripping the materials of their inherent characteristics. So even though differences are obvious, hard becomes the same as soft, wet as dry, heavy as light, moldy old sour cream as a shoe, wet leaves as old barbells. They become the same things. The entire culture colludes in this unnaming. Then we can call it all garbage, of no value whatsoever. To put it away, actually paying to put it away as soon as possible, thus forgotten. And then paying tremendously to remediate its effects on the land. So that's why in this 50-year-old social sculpture we have all produced of 4 mountains made from 150 million cubic yards of the undifferentiated, unnamed, no-value garbage whose every iota of material identity has been banished. The memorial, graveyard, or whatever it is, needs to be created out of an utterly opposite kind of social contract. So my question is, what could that utterly opposite kind of social contract be? What kinds of repositories might it produce or require? What maintenance work would it involve? What daily rituals and practices might it engender? What qualities of time, materiality, value, embodiment, and relationality might circulate at its core? Specifically, I'm wondering, and this is drawing on my background as a maker of performance, I'm wondering how performance itself can be a strategy to intervene in and productively denaturalize logics of disposability and help reorganize these infrastructures of care. Euclid's work goes to the places where trash collects to do that kind of performance intervention, and this transfer station brings that performance intervention to the place where trash becomes trash when it leaves your hand and goes into the bin. Following Euclid's, transfer station uses performance as itself an analytic to understand the operating logic that produces waste qua waste, and as a strategy for crafting different operations for managing that waste. So, how does it work? It will be here for you for the rest of the day. If you want to participate in it, it should be touched and used. I'm thinking of it as kind of a data collection device at this moment. I'm not sure where it's going to go next, but I'm really just curious how people use it, so don't be shy. So what does it do? How do you do it? It might look kind of familiar at first. You take the object you're discarding, you assess which bin is most appropriate, and you put it in said bin. But there are a few differences. Besides the different options presented for the afterlives of your trash, which we'll get into momentarily, this transfer station does not outsource the intensive labor of administrating waste once it's been discarded, which most of us do not usually have to participate in. In fact, the first step in using the transfer station is to take a documentation card, which is provided, and to designate what is the object you're discarding, what's it made of, and what it's meant to you in your time with it. You note the bin that you've selected for it, and then you put it in. Instead of the familiar afterlives of trash, recycling, or compost, your options at this transfer station are sacrifice, archive, or relish. Once you've made your deposit, I invite you to reflect on the experience, share your reflections. I have a little reflection journal that you can write in, or you could just talk to me or talk to anyone else. The more we talk about trash, the better, I think. And then you can do it again when you need to discard something else. As long as we're alive, we will be producing waste, so you will have ample opportunity to practice. And your contributions will be processed by me, your waste management facilitator, in the manner described. The items that go in the sacrifice bin will be cremated. Items that go in the archive bin will be preserved. And items that go in the relish bin will be enjoyed. And all of this information will be available for you to check in on at this link once I've done a bit more data collection.